Welcome everyone, Costini here with a discussion on the most essential DLCs for Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. Now, a piece of DLC content being considered essential does not mean that it is good. However, what it does mean is if you're going to play certain races in the game, you pretty much want to own that particular piece of DLC content. And we start with the Empire. In particular with the Hunter and the Beast. In fact, if you're going to play an Imperial campaign, I would argue that both DLC packs are essential, as much as Grim the Grave is not a great value DLC pack, nor is Hunter and the Beast, to be clear on this. They are both pretty important. Like, Grim the Grave does give you Arch-Lectors, which do matter as a lore choice, but Hunter and the Beast gives you something far more important. Two things that are far more important than anything in Grim and the Grave. So, with Hunter and the Beast, for the Empire, you're going to get archers. You can recruit archers from any tier 1 settlement, so you don't need the barracks, and you get your best tier 1 unit. Because if we look at the Empire, and what the Empire can recruit at tier 1, it doesn't look all that good. Yes, you could potentially get free company militia without Hunter and the Beast, but none of these units from the barracks are really good. And even in tier 2, sure, you get spearmen with shields, you get crossbows, you get Imperial Knights, you get pistoliers, but ultimately, archers are still pretty significant for the Empire to have, because one, they're cheap, and crucially, they're quite effective in the early game. And the most difficult part about any campaign, but especially for the Empire, is going to be the early game. The Empire is vulnerable as a race, as a faction, in the early game especially. Their roster overall is fairly weak. And while archers aren't the greatest way to fix that, they do provide a far more necessary tool than anything else in the early game, than any other unit that the Empire has in the early game. Yes, you can replace them later on with crossbows, but crossbows, while obviously being significantly better as a unit, they do cost quite a bit more, and they do need tier 2 and a tier 2 barracks. So when you're starting a campaign, it's going to take a while until you can start recruiting crossbowmen. In an Imperial campaign, if you're playing Karl Franz, if you're playing Gelt, if you're playing Volkmar or Marcus Wolfhard, you really need to get that good early start. And that's what archers allow you to do. But on top of that, a far more important unit later on in a campaign, our archers are very important early on, but huntsmen are essential for the entire campaign the moment you can recruit them in a campaign. They're a tier 3 unit, and they're the best ranged unit that the Empire has. Yes, you can use handgunners, but gunpowder units do have an issue. You'll look at huntsmen. While obviously they cost quite a bit more, and aren't necessarily significantly better than crossbowmen, at least in terms of the damage they're doing, they can fire while moving, they can stalk, and they can get Vanguard deployment. So for an Imperial army, you would start with archers, maybe get some crossbowmen at tier 2, but once you get to tier 3, you just basically want to recruit full-on huntsmen. And this is what makes this DLC so essential if you are going to play any Imperial campaign. Because the units it provides, at least 2 of the units it provides, are pretty important. Now, the war wagons, not so important in any way, shape, or form, but when you're looking at the huntsmen, when you're looking at archers, they are fairly significant to have in any Imperial campaign. Like, the huntsman will be your main range line in a long campaign. Better than crossbowmen, better than handgunners overall. Like, handgunners and crossbowmen do have their role, but like the best range unit are the huntsmen. And it's also a question of cost, right? Like some units, some range units, or some powerful units that are included in DLC packs are pretty expensive. Huntsmen are a cost-effective unit to get in a campaign. Second DLC to talk about is the Queen in a Crone DLC that involves both the High Elves and the Dark Elves that came out with Warhammer 2. For the High Elves, it includes Alariel the Radiant. For the Dark Elves, it includes Hellebrand. Now, Hellebrand is not held in high regard by the community, but she's a lot better as a Legendary Lord than people might believe. Though, of course, Morathi is substantially better in quite a few ways, so what does it matter? But here's the thing, there's always some DLC for a lot of these races in Warhammer 1 and 2 that contains the Regiments of Renown. This is the primary DLC for Regiments of Renown for the High Elves and Dark Elves. I mean, you will still get plenty of Regiments of Renown from other DLC packs, but this is the primary one that does affect them and gives you some of the best and certainly most plentiful Regiments of Renown for both High Elves and Dark Elves. But that's not the reason this DLC is on the list. In fact, none of the units in this DLC are actually that very important. Though there are certainly some good choices, of course, like for the High Elves in particular, you get the Sisters of Avalorn, which are your best ranged unit. Though how much you would be using Sisters of Avalorn, that is its own discussion. But this DLC does contain some decent units, some powerful units. But here's the really important point and why this DLC is on this list. And if you're going to play a High Elf campaign, I would firmly recommend it. There's multiple reasons behind that. One, if you're going to play a campaign as Tyrion, for instance, you won't be able to confederate Alariel, if I'm not mistaken, unless you own this DLC. So your control over Ulthuan will never be complete. So if you're playing a High Elf campaign, you really want this DLC. Hell, you may even want Elfarian's DLC. Though Elfarian, I would argue, is less of an issue. Alariel is a bigger problem to not be able to confederate her, given the territory she tends to take in a campaign. That's one thing to mention. But everything that I've just mentioned so far is unimportant compared to what really matters with this DLC for this High Elves. This really does affect the High Elves more than Dark Elves, though keep in mind there is also a fairly major effect on Dark Elves as well. But for the High Elves, this DLC contains the Handmaiden hero. And if you're playing any High Elven campaign, it doesn't matter if you're an Ulthuan, doesn't matter if you're playing Techless, doesn't matter if you're going with Elfarian on the other side in the middle of the Badlands. If you're playing a High Elven campaign, you want this DLC for the Handmaidens alone. The reason Handmaidens are so important is something I've mentioned in video after video. They give you a diplomacy bonus, which means trade is easier, which means your economy gets stronger. They give you influence per turn with the special skill line. Yes, you do have to sacrifice some combat skills for it, but it's well worth it. And then they give you trade tariffs at the same amount as a building that takes a building slot. And on top of that, most importantly, they give you one control each to all provinces. And this stacks, like influence, trade tariffs, diplomatic relations that each of these handmaidens has, it stacks. In fact, handmaidens are arguably one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful hero choice from a campaign mechanic standpoint, because they give you control, they give you influence, they give you trade tariffs, so they're boosting your economy, they're boosting your diplomacy, they're boosting your level of control faction-wide for each of them. Now, if you're not playing Alariel, you do need a tier 4 settlement to increase their capacity, which obviously is an issue to tackle. But even a limited number of handmaids will have a significant impact on any High Elven campaign. So while the High Elves certainly are a very playable race without the Queen and the Crone, I would say, like, if you want to play a real High Elven campaign, you want this DLC. For one hero alone, but this is the thing about essential DLCs. It doesn't have to be anything else, but it can be just one thing that has a major impact. For Hunter and the Beast, it's two things. It's Archers and Huntsmen. For Queen and the Crone, it is the Handmaiden alone. And we can talk about the value of Sisters, Regiments of Renown, all the things that Dark Elves also have in this DLC. But this DLC is pretty essential for playing a High Elven campaign at the moment. The third DLC to talk about is the Prophet and the Warlock DLC that affects both the Skaven and the Lizardmen. The Lizardmen aspect, I mean, there's some important stuff over there for the Lizardmen as well, but really this DLC is all about the Skaven. In fact, for the longest time, this was considered the most important DLC in the game because of the things that it did for the Skaven. Now it is less important given the situation with gunpowder units, so Jezzails and Rattling Gunners, which are part of this DLC. not really quite as important to achieve success in a Skaven campaign. However, Jezzails in particular are still really good units, not just because of their combat ability, though their very long range certainly makes them far more effective as gunpowder units than many other units in the game, but more importantly, the units that we're talking about, Jezzails, Rattling Gunners, they are high armored. They're units with high levels of armor, which means that they'll do better in auto-resolve and they'll take less damage in battles, which is pretty important during the course of a campaign. This DLC also includes the Warlock Master as a Lord for the Skaven. Though the Warlock Master isn't necessarily essential, it's still a really nice addition. But Jezzails, Rattling Gunners, when you put all of this together, like the units as well as the Lord choice, as well as other things you have as part of this DLC, it does become a fairly important DLC to have if you're going to be playing a Skaven campaign. On top of that, this DLC also contains a lot of the Regiments of Renown for the Skaven, because this was the first real DLC for a Skaven, and the way Creative Assembly used to handle things, not anymore, but the way they used to handle things, they would bundle these Regiments of Renown with one particular DLC far more than others. There are Regiments of Renown, of course, with the Twisted and Twilight, the one that added Front Unclean. There's also, of course, Regiments of Renown with Clan Ishin. But this one will give you a good amount of Regiments of Renown, and pretty solid ones at that. So if you're going to be playing a Skaven campaign, of all the DLCs you want to have, like even if you're going to play in Clan Ishin campaign, you still want to own this DLC. While you may not use Jezzails and Rattling Gunners as much in other campaigns, you still would want to make use of them to a certain extent. And Doomflayers are always a solid addition to an army. Again, high levels of armor, do pretty well in battles. Doomwheels leave a lot. Doomwheels are disappointing because they tend to take a lot of damage in dot resolve for whatever reason. This is an issue for Ikeclaw himself because he can ride the Doomwheel. But Doomflayers, completely different discussion. They won't take a ridiculous amount of damage in dot resolve. So with this DLC, you can really make a pretty powerful ranged army, or powerful armies in general, for the Skaven with a high level of armor, which is actually quite important for a Skaven, because while they do have other effective armies, those armies tend to do pretty poorly in auto-resolve. So if you want to play Skaven in a way that where you will be able to just win a lot of battles, especially settlement battles, without having to actually fight them and be annoyed by that, because you're fighting battles you know you're going to win and they're going to be won with little to no effort, this is the DLC to go for. And again, this was considered the most essential DLC for quite a long time. Not quite so essential right now, but that's more so given the gunpowder situation in Warhammer 3. That does affect Jezzails and Rattling Gunners. Rattling Gunners in particular are affected by this. The problem is that Rattling Gunners, the way they're designed as a unit, they will do a lot of damage, but they need to get continuous fire on target, which is an issue when gunpowder units just stop working quite a lot of the time in battles. Like, one of the reasons the Chaos Dwarves are so good with gunpowder units is not that their gunpowder units work in a different fashion, it's that the blunderbusses in particular do a ton of damage with every shot. Fireglaves, different discussion, but Fireglaves do have a huge amount of range. And then the final piece of DLC content to talk about, it is the King and the Warlord DLC that came out with Warhammer 1, including Belegar and Skarsnik. Now, neither Belegar or Skarsnik are worth playing their campaigns as. Belegar is worth confederating, Skarsnik not so much. I mean, Skarsnik is so worthless as a legendary lord that you don't really even want to use him if you confederate him. Like, a generic lord might do a better job than Skarsnik. The situation is that sad with regards to poor old Skarsnik over here. However, just because the campaigns aren't worth it does not mean that this DLC is worthless. Quite the contrary, this DLC is quite important for both the greenskins and the dwarves, I would argue, are pretty unplayable regardless of what DLC or not, but if you want to play a dwarven campaign, don't do so if you don't own this DLC. So what does this DLC add for both the dwarves and the greenskins? Well, this is the main DLC pack that contains the Regiments of Renown, the majority of the Regiments of Renown for both races. In fact, for dwarves, it's all the regiments are renowned. For the dwarves, you also get the Rune Lord choice, which is quite important, especially early on in a campaign when you just won't be running around with a lot of runesmiths. And even later on in the campaign, still very crucial to have that. So regiments renown, Rune Lord. Then you also have rangers. The value of rangers, that's a complete discussion to be had on that, but they do give you a different range option as opposed to just relying on quarrelers. And they give you this kind of sneaky army, but they do lose in the armor department, which is a downside, a fairly major one. But rangers certainly can work well. But really, for the dwarves, it's the Rune Lord and the regiment's renown, as well as the ability confederating Bellegarde, that makes this DLC worth it on its own. Like, on its own, just the dwarven stuff would be worth it. But on the greenskin side of things, yes, regiment's renown, a lord choice that's not important, a legendary lord that's not important, but one of the most important units flat out in the entire game that makes the greenskins a powerhouse. Like, the greenskins, even without this DLC, are still a very powerful race. But it is with this DLC that they become an unstoppable tide of death and destruction. And that's because of one unit to realize how ridiculous things are. That unit is the infamous Nasty Skulker. Now, why are Nasty Skulkers so good? While Nasty Skulkers won't necessarily scale too well in a very long campaign, because they'll just end their low stats overall, their low baseline stats won't serve them well in long engagements. Early on in campaign, these guys dominate the battlefield. They can fight units that are much higher tier. If you put a goblin, if you recruit a Goblin Great Shaman with Goblin Tide, they gain a significant amount of armor, which makes them far more effective. Doubles their armor, actually. And a lot of the research that greenskins have early in their campaign buff Goblin units by a significant amount. So having Nasty Skulkers in a greenskin campaign, in all of them virtually, makes the greenskins far stronger. Like, Nasty Skulkers, they're cheap. I mean, Skarsnik has much cheaper Nasty Skulkers in terms of both recruitment and upkeep because of his faction bonus of minus 40% upkeep and recruitment costs. But for all the other legendary lords of the greenskins, Nasty Skulkers are an essential early game campaign unit. You can choose your way in sieges, but even if you're not going to do so, they will give you a significant battle advantage, because most of the damage that Nasty Skulkers do is armor-piercing damage. And when you buff them up, they gain a significant amount of leadership, a decent amount of armor, and they can really hold their own against units that are, again, much higher tier, much more expensive to recruit than these guys are. And this, in turn, allows the greenskins to get a bunch of cheap but highly effective armies from very early on in the campaign. You can make do if you don't have this DLC with Goblin Archers, to be sure, from early on in the campaign, but Nasty Skulkers are a very important unit. And certainly the meta of Warhammer 3 has shifted from a complete range focus, as it was in Warhammer 1 and Warhammer 2, to a really melee-focused playstyle. So the races and the lords, factions that have really powerful melee armies will tend to do better in Warhammer 3 at the moment, and that's what Nasty Skulkers provide the greenskins. Because otherwise, what are you going to recruit as the greenskins? Well, you're going to be stuck using Orc Boys, which they're decent enough, but they're a relatively weak unit in quite a few ways. So you really want to go down the path of Nasty Skulkers. Like, Nasty Skulkers have a huge amount of melee attack. They can last quite well in melee. They can withstand the cavalry charge because they have the ability of slowing units down, including reducing their charge bonus. So they can withstand a knight charge of Bretonia. Yes, these guys will tear Bretonian knights in melee, and those Bretonian knights will not be able to get their major charge bonus against them. So fairly effective units, very much worth having. And then you add all the dwarf stuff. Yeah, this is a fairly important piece of DLC content to have if you're going to play Greenskin or Dwarven campaign in Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. And that is it. Costine signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.